Welcome back. This week we are putting our sashing and our borders on. The great thing is all of our blocks are 32 inches square. We've got 4 of them. So we're going to have one 32-inch piece on the right-hand side of block 4. And then you've got your choice. You can decide whether you're just going to put a 32-inch strip onto the right-hand side of block 4, or maybe the left-hand side, if I could get my left and right. So you're going to put one sashing strip on either side of block 4, and then on the right-hand side of block 3, again, a 32-inch by 5-inch sashing strip on there. And then you're going to join them together. Now, I know at the minute you're thinking, huh? So let me show you. We've got a little bit more space here, so I'll show you how we do this. We're going to glide this over here. So we're going to have one sashing strip attached there. We're then going to have another sashing strip over here. And then we're going to have our block 4, making sure we've got everything in the right direction. And then we're going to put another sashing strip on the edge over here. Doing the same for blocks 1 and 2 as well. Let's start those, and then we'll crack on with doing the bits in the middle with the cornerstones. Now, it's really important that we make sure that we don't have any wrinkles or creases or bubbles in our borders or into our sashing strips. Now, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to measure your block. Measure that your block measures 32 inches square. That's what it should do. The likelihood is you may be 32 1/4, 32 1/2, 31, 31 1/2. Whatever the measurement of your block is fine. You're going to cut your sashing strips to the same size. Now, the reason you want to do that, a number of clients will bring quilts into me where they put the sashing and the border strip at the bottom, the feed dog sucks it all in, and they don't measure, and then they just literally cut it off at the end and we're fine. Now, normally that's not too much of a problem, but if your sashing strip does cause if it's a little bit longer, it does mean then when you come to quilt it, you've got a little bit of a wavy line. So to avoid the wavy lines, I always try and measure that everything is along as close to the correct size as it can be. And what I always like to do is to put my sashing strip at the bottom when it's the same measurement, and that way then I'm going to make sure that none of these fold along as we go along. If they do, that's not a problem, but it just makes your life that little bit easier. So what I've got here is my block 4. I'm sewing onto, you can see this is my block 4 over here. I'm sewing onto the right-hand side with my sashing strip. So I'm going to do the right-hand side of my sashing strip there, and then I'm going to do the left-hand side and then attach block 3 so that you know where we are. And in order to make sure that we're not sucking too much of our sashing strip into the feed dogs, I'm just letting the machine do the work for me. I'm not pushing, I'm not pulling, I'm just letting the machine do the work for itself. And the thing to remember as well, when you have got a triangle, like over here, you can see we've got a point over here. I'm going to try and catch that point on there by being able to get my needle all the way through there. If it works, fantastic. If it doesn't, that is okay. Whoops. When you do it, focus as you're going past that you're not going wrong on here. And by that, you'll see what I mean is I'm catching my stitch just there to try and catch the point as I go along. If you don't get it right, that's absolutely fine. Don't feel bad. Okay, so we can see along there, we've managed to catch these points absolutely beautifully. And when I open it up, you can see I've just nailed it there. That's exactly what we're looking for. So we've done the right-hand side. Now I'm going to do exactly the same thing again with another sashing strip on the left-hand side. And as you can tell, that measures perfectly. That's exactly what we're looking for. I have measured these before to double check the measurements, and they've worked brilliantly. And now is we've got our block 3, and I've attached the sashing to the left and to the right. Make sure you get this the right way around. So I've attached it to the right and to the left, and it's important to make sure we get this in the right direction. So obviously the block number 4 is on the right-hand side of your quilt, and block number 3, luckily not directional, is going onto the left-hand side. So all I'm going to do here is where I've got my sashing strip against number 4, I'm quite simply going to sew number 3 onto number 4, going straight down there. And now we're sewing these together from there. This is now blocks 3 and 4 going together. And this is when a little bit under half your quilt is ready to go. Just like what we did before, I'm just taking the sashing strip at the bottom so that I can make sure that I don't end up with any curled seams in my back. And if I do, it doesn't matter. You just try and do the best that you can. And then onto the left-hand side of block number 3, we're going to do exactly the same and pop a sashing strip on the end. The method I'm doing now, you're going to do exactly the same for blocks 1 and 2, and we'll then be ready to put them all together. And we now have sashing strip, block 3, sashing strip, block 4, and sashing strip. Easy peasy. And do the same for block 1 and 2. Now, because we've done our blocks 1 and 2 on Quilter's Grid, what we do need to do is to tidy this end up as we go along. Now, you'll see I've got a little bit of an excess along here. All I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my pair of scissors and I'm going to carefully just trim along this line all the way down to be able to make sure that I've got a nice clean edge to be sewing my sashing strip along. You don't have to do this. The advantage of doing this is you won't run the risk of losing your seam with your sashing strip and twisting your seams. I prefer to trim this as you go along. You're more than welcome to use a rotary cutter. You're more than welcome to do any way you prefer. I do personally prefer using a pair of scissors. I just think you've got a closer idea of what you're stitching, what you're trimming towards, and it just gives it that nice clean finish, and you've got the end already done. And then all you're doing once you've trimmed that off is you're taking your sashing strip, you've measured it that it works correctly, you're attaching it to the side, and then you're sewing along the line to get it done. It just gives you a nice clean line to be stitching along, and I personally prefer to make sure that you've got everything as lined up and as neat as you can possibly get it. And you can see that gives you your sashing strip on one side of your block 1, and you repeat that all the way along for blocks 1 and 2. So there we go. We have now created our 2 big giant strips that are going across, all the sashing strips on the side, and now what we need to do is the sashing strips on the top and the bottom. Now again, this is where your measurements are really important. Make sure that you measure these in order to make sure that the strips that you're attaching are going to be the correct length going across here, and then you've obviously got your cornerstones going in between each one of those sashing strips. So the trick now is to triple check your measurement from the beginning of this block to the edge of that block, making sure you take into account the seam allowance and making sure that this piece of fabric is the same. The trick is, when you're doing the middle sections, is making sure that 1 and 3, 2 and 4 are the same size. I know we can do this. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It's going to be beautiful. So what I've done now is I have measured across the top of block 1 and the top of block 2. So this is my top row. And how it goes is you've got a blue cornerstone, which is going to go on the one end, which will be the left-hand side. And then obviously that takes you across of across the top of block 1. You've then got another cornerstone, so you're going to put that in here. And at this point, you're obviously now attaching the sashing strip that's going on the top of block 2, which we've now measured to be exactly the same size as block 2. And I'm going to measure that and cut it to the correct size. And then I'm sewing it to the central cornerstone. And then obviously the end piece needs another cornerstone as well. So what you're going to have here is 2 sashing strips and 3 cornerstones. Now, my top tip, until you actually start cutting it, is I know that this is going on the end of my block 2, so I just leave that on until I actually start sewing this all together. You don't have to do that. You can be cleverer than I am and you can separate it, but I know that that is going onto the end of my block 2 on that side. I've got my wonderful collection over here. Make sure you've got this the right way around because you will potentially sew it upside down. So I know that that's my top of my block 1, and I know that's my top of my block 2. I know, having just done and cut this, that this is going over here onto block 1 because I've measured these all the way along. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to line this up. Oh, that looks perfect. Oh, I'm a happy bunny now. And what I'm going to do is now sew this onto the top of it. So the key bit over here is, if I can show you nice and close here, what you'd love to be able to do is to nest these seams perfectly so that your cornerstone there ends perfectly with the end of the side sashing strip. That's your goal. That would be the ideal. If you can get that, woohoo! If you can't get that, that's okay. Okay, and if I fold this back, oh, look how beautiful that is. That is exactly what we're looking for there. That beautiful little mitered, not mitered, but that perfect point there is what you're looking for, so that the sashing joins your cornerstone. That's the goal. That's the ideal. That's the gold medal standard. If you get it right, awesome. If you don't, that's okay. Don't stress about it. And the great thing with the quilter's grid is it gives you a really nice, stable surface to be stitching into. And our last little spot there, oh, almost got it, but we're a tiny little bit out there as well. So that's what we're doing there on the top, and you can see that that is now our border on the top, and we've done the sides. Now we're going to repeat this for the bottom of 3 and 4, and I'll show you that in a moment. So what I've done now is I've got blocks 1 and 2 with the top strip and the sides, and I've done 3 and 4 with the bottom strip and the sides. Now the most difficult part of this is the central section, because it doesn't matter how good a quilter you are, you're going to end up with one of your blocks being slightly bigger, one of them being slightly smaller, and you may end up with a little bit of a lackadaisical, not quite meeting in the middle thing. And you've got two options. You can either go and try and get the angles right and the exact measurements right and get it perfect. That must be your choice. I personally am quite happy not getting it exactly perfect because I like that organic feel to it. But in order to get it right, if you want to, what you're going to do is you're going to measure the bottom of block 1, you're going to measure the top of block 3, and you're going to see what measurements they are. Fingers crossed, they match. If they don't match, you can then make a decision on how you're going to do it. I personally am making the same. I'm picking the difference. So if I've got a difference of about 1/8 of an inch between the two. So what I've done is I've cut my piece to be 1/8 of an inch. So one will be slightly longer, one will be slightly smaller. And I'm just going to accept I may not get it exactly perfect. You must do what works best for you. But the central strip is exactly the same as what we did for the top and the bottom. You're going to have a cornerstone. You're going to have a sashing strip. And you're going to sew those together. You've got a sashing strip, a cornerstone right in the middle of that sashing strip. And you're going to sew your sashing strip to your cornerstone. So we're doing 3 of these throughout the quilt. We've attached one to the top of 1 and 2, and one to the bottom of 3 and 4, and now this one is going in the middle. What I do advise is when you are putting the blocks all together and you're doing the central section, I have gone and I have pressed this really, really, really well. And I always start with the one that is the biggest. Whoops. And by that, I mean where my blocks are bigger on the base, I always start by putting my cornerstones on this one here. And what I always try and do is I put this piece on the bottom and I line everything up, and that way then any little extra bits that I've got on here will be eaten up by the feed dogs. And you're lining these up to try and match your cornerstones as best you can, and we're just going to put it all the way down there. And we are almost there. And did we match the seam? Not bad, not bad. So now what we've done is we have got everything laying out now. We've got the top onto blocks 3 and 4. And what I'm now going to do is attach blocks 1 and 2. Now, these ones are a little bit smaller than the ones that I've done here. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to line everything up and I'm going to put this piece onto the feed dogs on the bottom, hoping that that 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch that I'm slightly out by will be sucked in by the feed dogs, and you shouldn't notice it. The key is to be able to try and get that extra bit in at the beginning or in the middle of it here, because if you get it right at the edge where the cornerstones are, it's going to be very, 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 very visible, which is not what we're looking for. And now we have finished the central section of our quilt. I'm going to press it and you can see it in a moment. So loose threads and all, this is what you're going to have. You've got block 1, 2, 3 and 4, and this is your quilt with the sashing. We still have to put your border on. There's a 5-inch border when it's finished. I'm putting a 6-inch border on, as I discussed in video 1. And the reason being is when I do the quilting, I then get to trim it down to the right size. I think you can see by the scale of this, using 5 inches is amazing. If you want to use a 4-inch square or a 3-inch square or a 2-inch square and a 1-inch square, you'll end up with exactly the same design. Quilter's grid will be your friend the smaller you go, but this is our piece without the border on. You may not want to put the border on. I'm going to chuck one on anyway because I love a really big quilt. And this is the Vlieseline Quilt-a-Long with us. Thank you so much, and we'll be back. So what I've done now is we've sewn these 2 pieces together. I have taken a tape measure. I've measured across the top of my quilt, the sides of my quilt for these 2. And I've got the 2 cut to size now, and these are now going to go on the left and the right hand side. What I've also done is the ones that are going on the top and the bottom, I've double checked the measurements with my tape measure accurately, making sure that these all line up perfectly. So all I'm going to do on these 2 is to sew the cornerstones on the other end of it. And we've got 4 seams to go and the quilt is finished. So cornerstones on, so that means that once I've done my sides, I'm very easily able to just carry on putting the top and the bottom on without having to break my quilting stride. What I do say to people is always, you've got a really big piece of fabric here. There is nothing more annoying than getting to the other end and having sewn this on the wrong side. So I always make sure that I keep my fabric open. I check my seams are done the right way round. And when I do that, I then put the fabrics right sides together and stitch down the side. It just saves you a nasty little surprise if you have to unpick when you put the top on. So that's my top and bottom ready to go on. I'm going to take those and I'm going to fold them and I'm going to put them just over here next to our lovely little Vlieseline whale. And now we're going to take our side seams and put this down the left and the right hand side. And this is block number 1. This is block number 3. And I'm making sure that I get these folded the right way. And right side of the fabric here to the right side of the fabric here, and we're going to sew all the way down. Make sure you check that this is going the correct way. Often we stitch them and they go incorrectly. If you check it at the beginning, it makes your life a lot easier as you're going along. At this point, you can have a little bit of a celebration because you're only 4 seams away from finishing your quilt top. 1 down. 3 to go. Just like we did before, make sure that your seam is going and pressing right side to your fabrics. Nothing worse than having to unpick the whole thing. It's a big piece of fabric this, so make sure you're taking your time. Don't rush it. Just be nice and slow and steady. Now the great thing about this, you know you've done it correctly if when you're at this point, coming to the edge of your piece and look how perfectly your border lines up there. That is what the dream is. If you've managed to get that, that's awesome. And if you haven't, that's okay. You can trim it down or add a seam in, no one's going to mind. 2 seams to go now, and that is the top and the bottom. And we'll be right back. Now we're putting our top and bottom on. I'm just checking now. I think we're putting our top on here. And what you're looking to do here is this little cornerstone that you've got for your outer border should nestle beautifully into this section over here, and you can see that that lines up beautifully. And then you must decide how you want to nest your seams, which way round, or place your seams open. I'm going to do it that way. And you're just now sewing on the last 2 seams of your border. We're almost there, boys and girls, almost there. So there are only 2 points on this line that you want to make sure that you're lining up. And that is the 2 cornerstones. So we've managed to get that cornerstone done. And all I'm doing now is I'm just manipulating this enormous quilt top into my lap, and to be able to get the top border piece on, lined up, ready to go. And because it's such a big piece of fabric, make sure you take your time. If you're finding the weight of the fabric is pulling your quilt, like there, just get everything onto the table, take the weight off this needle, and just take it nice and slow. And we've now got 1 90-inch seam to go, and look how we nailed that point. So these are the points that we're mainly trying to make sure that we get. That one has worked absolutely perfectly. Woo! And the last seam that we have over here is our beautiful long 90-inch piece. And we're going to do it exactly the same. And we're going to cross our fingers that we match our points. And if we don't, that's okay. So remember, we've got that point now, we've matched that. Just take a little bit of time now to position the quilt that's going to be easiest for you to sew. I'm putting everything on the table here, so there's no weight on the machine. And the seam that we're stitching on, I'm just laying that, lining this all up, and making it easier to make sure that everything flows and stitches beautifully. And the last few inches are ready to go. Sorry, I get very excited every time you put the last border on, and now we're going to lay this out outside and you can have a look. And here we have the finished quilt. Borders, sashing, everything. It works out to just under 90 inches. And I think you can see it's a fun quilt. It's vibrant, lots and lots of colour, and really easy to make, I think. Especially for the scale of it, something like this has worked really well. I love the fact that we've been able to make 1 block a week. And now the last thing that's left to do is obviously to quilt it. So join us for our last episode next week on how it is we're going to quilt this gorgeous quilt.